Hello again, OT Julie. I am going to be talking a little bit about fine motor and coloring and grasp for young kids. So if you have a child that is working on their drawing, their coloring, their pre-writing strokes, their fine motor, especially if they have a grasp eye, it can be helpful if you break the crayons in half that you have your child use so that you have smaller crayons. You'll notice that with a full-size crayon, a child can hold with their whole fist. We call this a gross grasp. And this one is actually called a gross supinated grasp. Once the child flips and starts to have their thumb down, this one is called a gross pronated grasp. From here, we tend to see them move to what's called a digital pronate, where they're kind of supporting the utensil along their pointing finger, and they would make marks like this. And then from there, we start to see them typically start to move toward a tripod or a quadruped, which are considered the most functional. We want to ideally, once they get really good at using their fingertips, we want to see the movement, especially then coming from our fingers rather than our wrist or our whole arm. So when we have a bigger utensil or a longer crayon or marker, the child they're more inclined to hold it with a gross grasp. Whereas if you have a smaller crayon, a broken piece, they can't fist their whole hand and still color. There's none of the crayon sticking out. So it kind of forces them to start to use their fingertips and strengthen the muscles to use their fingertips, to oppose their thumb and move their hand in that way. So my recommendation would be if you have a child that is working on that, to break all of their crayons into half. You can break it into thirds. That can be a little trickier for really getting those fingertips too. The other thing I was going to mention is that the typical stroke for children to develop is first they're going to be starting with scribbling up and down. This is after of course we first see just kind of odd scribbles. Then we start to see scribbles in a directional manner that might go up and down, and then they might start to scribble side to side, and then we start to see the continuous circles that go around and around. So you wouldn't be surprised then that the typical progression is vertical lines are easier to draw for children than others. So developmentally they'll come first. They're just pulling the crayon toward their body. Next is a horizontal line, also straight. We have a circle. I should mention the horizontal line also, it typically stays on one side of the body because it does go from side to side, but typically kids in these early stages, they're still working on strengthening the connection between the two hemispheres of their brain. So crossing midline, once we get from circle, we have intersecting lines, and then our diagonal lines, sometimes called sliding lines. Those are kind of tricky because they tend to require the child to move in front of the other side of their body. So that, like if they're drawing a big line, they have to cross their right arm in front of the left side of their body and slide across. So that's the typical progression. We talked about the small crayons. And it does take time. All kids develop different skills at different rates. And there's a lot of activities you can work on before you get to working on the pre-writing strokes. But you'll notice that these are the strokes, the shapes, the basic shapes that are used to make all of our letters. Curves, we do get into some other curves, but circles, I mean the circle has the curves going all the way around in each direction. Parsing out a magic C, or the C that is on with the curve on the left side, that gets to be a little bit later once they start to focus on their handwriting. And then once we do start to work on letters, we typically start with all capitals because capitals are all the same size. So it's easier to learn our capital letters than our lowercase letters that can be tall, they can be small, fitting in just the small letter space, and they can go below the baseline. There are 5 lowercase letters that descend into that lower below the baseline space that can be really tricky for a lot of kids to be able to remember their shape and their alignment relative to the baseline since it fluctuates in lowercase. Also, once we're working on our capital letters, a lot of times it's helpful to choose letters from the child's name or to just start working with the child's name because it's something that is meaningful to the child that they are going to have a bit more ownership and really try to learn. Of course, this is most helpful especially in early strokes, it's easier if they have a lot of the straight lines rather than diagonals. Kids that have a lot of sliding lines, diagonals in their name, that can be a little trickier to start with. But then once they get it, it's no problem, of course. Anyways, main point, rate those crayons for your kids. Bye.